So Josh, you coming over later tonight to watch the game?
I got to double check with my wife, but I think I should be fine.
Check with your wife? So who wears the pants in your marriage? Haven't you read Ephesians 5? Man is the head of woman?
What are you talking about? You saying you never ask your wife for permission to do stuff?
She has read the passage.
I don't actually believe you.
Okay. I did the dishes and I vacuumed, so it's all good. You can come over tonight.
Yeah, okay, that sounds a little bit more correct. And then that actually leads me to a question I wanted to ask you, like the relationship dynamic. What should the role between men and women be in the church and at home?
Yes, correct. In both of those contexts, Christians, not surprisingly, disagree on what the relationship with men and women should look like, particularly in the sense of authority or not. So we should talk about it today.
Yeah, that sounds pretty important.
Yeah. Today, we're going to dive into another controversial topic of women in leadership. What does the Bible say about it? How do Christians view it? And what are the merits and limitations of both of these views? So, Josh, talk to me about a little bit of the context for this.
Sure. This conversation usually breaks down into two positions. We have what's known as egalitarianism, which believes that, women can do anything men can do in spiritual leadership positions, be elders, be pastors, the whole nine. And then you have complementarianism, which tends to reserve the highest offices of church stuff usually for men, right? So women can be pastors, kind of, like up to a certain point, and that can vary depending on like which denomination you're in, but usually it's pretty ubiquitous and universal that women aren't lead pastors at a church or senior pastors, and women aren't elders of that church, right? Because the idea there is that position holds that women aren't supposed to have authority over men in the church.
Okay, so those are two fancy words there, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, egalitarian, which is the position that wants to affirm both equality in nature and in role.
Yeah.
And then you have complementarian, which is the opposing perspective, which would say, hey, you can have equality in dignity, nature, and value, but a difference in role.
Right. So it's complementary versus equal, right? Those are kind of the ways that you can think about it.
Let's break them down. Talk to me.
Sure. So the complementarian role really affirms that, right? This idea of being created equally in essence, but given different roles. Okay. So here's how we kind of understand that and put it another way. So men and women are both made by God, right? Genesis 1:26, we were created in God's image, male and female, God created us. Right? We are equal in dignity, value, essence, and human nature. However, the roles that we are to play in this world are unique, right? We don't share the same positioning. So men were given the instructions to have loving authority over women, and women are to offer willing, glad-hearted, and submissive sacrifice or assistance to the male.
Okay.
And so we know that, though men and women are created equally in God's image, and we see that in Genesis, like we said, but Genesis 2 kind of bears out in its own context and what complementarians would say Paul understands as the role of nature in 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Timothy 2. The way that men and women interact in the world is different, right? And it's intentionally different because God set it up this way for the most effective form of leadership and the way that it should be understood. And so the idea here is that females are supposed to function in a submissive role under the leadership and loving authority of the male. Now, let's be very clear before we move on here that this is always intended to be understood in the sacrificial sense, right?
Okay.
So men are supposed to lead, but are supposed to lead sacrificially there.
Correct.
So we don't want to create a straw man or a caricature of this argument if you're watching at home. The idea here is to have the best assumption about the argumentative position as you go into listening to
Correct.
the topic, right?
So in itself, this isn't necessarily something like machismo or something like sexism or misogyny.
Right, absolutely.
Not in itself, according to this biblical understanding.
Yeah. And so the complementarian who's doing it correctly would never paint himself or herself as a sexist, right, or anything like that. And so there's kind of two specific points that relay into this complementarian viewpoint. The first one is the fallen disruption of God's created design, right? And this is a really fancy way of basically saying, we see, when the snake enters the garden and tempts Eve to eat the apple, tempts Eve to eat the fruit, right? Sin basically brings chaos into God's world. And in that dispute, there's going to be enmity between the man and the wife, right? There's going to be the potential for anger or resentment or bitterness that comes out of this because their eyes being opened in this way, in the way that they understand each other. And this is what Genesis 3:15 and 16 teaches, that there's going to have to always be this conversational difficulty of women trying to usurp the authority of men and the authority that was given to men by God in creation, right? And so men either have to choose to lead this woman well, or it can be abused, right, in the way that men lead. And so again, fall and disruption of God's created design. And then when we get to the New Testament, when we see the restored picture of what this looks like, Paul, who writes Ephesians 5, uses really the example of head, male, and female in the relationship is the example of like Christ and the church. So the idea here is like.
So what's that passage again?
Ephesians 5, 22 through 33. And so
Just in your own words?
Yeah. So the idea here is like we are supposed to submit to Christ, like men submit to Christ, women submit to men in the same way that the church submits to Christ.
There you go.
And Christ led the church by a beautiful example of being willing to sacrifice his life for her. He dedicated himself to his bride, all of those things.
So that's the paradigm.
That is what we are supposed to be emulating as men who are followers of Jesus and who are married.
Correct.
And then the church responds to Christ by emulating what Christ does and trying to be its best version of Christ on earth.
Yeah.
And so women submit to their godly husbands by loving them and supporting them and helping them stay, in pursuit of Jesus and all the good things that come with that. And so, and then we also see that again in 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15.
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting passage there.
Yeah, that one's a little bit more difficult, right? For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it can feel a little bit weird here. The idea here is like we understand men and women through the way that we are created in nature, right? So Eve was created after Adam there in this idea. And so male leadership then is seen to be restored to this Christian community of men and women who endeavor together in the journey of expressiveness, but there is still some order, right? Some hierarchical, potentially understood order in the way that those things are supposed to function in reality there.
Which admittedly is a bit foreign.
Sure.
Right? The logic is a bit foreign to how we kind of function day
today.
To day.
Yeah.
For sure. So some interesting stuff there. But I think you captured the complementarian position very fairly.
Okay, good.
Okay, so what are some questions that somebody would ask of the complementarian? Yeah,
so these are some of the things that we see in Scripture, right? And so, again, when you're thinking about this position here, it's really important to understand that all of this position is rooted in a specific understanding of Scripture. So it's not like people are making things up. It's not like people are trying to go out and just be abusive or be authoritative for the sake of like a power trip and an ego, right? But some of the questions that I, as not a complementarian, would have is like, what do we do when there are examples of women in the highest positions of leadership in Scripture, right? So we see this in Deborah, who's a judge. We see this in Phoebe in Romans 16, who Paul has, commended to read and interpret his letter for him to the Roman church that's there. You see this in Huldah in 2 Kings 22, who's this prophetess, who's I think as the Old Testament guy, you would say, is like this juxtaposition or this comparison against the unsuccessful male prophets.
Yeah.
And then you have Lydia, who's an important figure in Acts 16, who is actually like this benefactor and makes it so that these people have a chance to worship God in a home there by supplying their own place. You have Priscilla, who is mentioned first, and Priscilla and Aquila, which usually means, when couples were listed in antiquity in ancient writings, the person who was listed first was understood to be the more authoritative one in the relationship there. And so these are like hard things to get around. So how do complementarians deal with that type of position?
Yeah, definitely. So I think we have to concede, and let me just be completely honest with you.
Sure.
Okay? I grew up in a church that was very, very, very complementarian, to the point where it was probably distortive. And in my educational journey and personal journey, I would say I've walked away from a distortive version of complementarianism because it's bad, right?
Sure.
It's abusive. However, I would probably still identify as a soft complementarian, and so I want to be just very honest.
Sure.
And put my cards on the table and say that
we got you now, dude.
As time goes on,
boom, cornered him. Get him, internet.
As time goes on, it's become harder and harder for me to actually be a complementarian for many reasons. So the first thing I want to say is that there are real abuses and distortions of authority that happen in churches, that happened in homes, and that happen in different places by Christians. And that is absolutely shameful. So it just absolutely breaks my heart when I think it was last year, there was like 3 huge like mega church pastors, one after another, that were It's what seems to be legitimate accusations of both manipulation, coercion, and or sexual mishappenings, so that you may or may not attribute to power coercion, whatever the case is. Domestic violence is obviously a real thing, and Christians aren't immune to it.
No, of course not.
And so I want to be very clear about that is absolutely shameful, and that we need to bring more light to that, so that people who are being abused can feel that they have a voice to be supported and rescued, and that God and God's people care about that.
Yeah.
I want to be very clear about that.
Yeah, good.
Having said that, right, I have to concede that these passages are definitely monkey wrenches, right? For the complementarian perspective of Scripture, right? Like, you really have to do some gymnastics to say, well, we're going to qualify woman leadership, but it was at that time. Or it was because there was no man to lead at that time. Or that stands over and against some of the other commands. So I will concede with the people that I've talked to actually to wrestle with some of these passages. It's a real monkey wrench, right? Because in the book of Judges, Deborah functions like a judge in the capacity that any other male judge would. She has military power. She has power basically of the state, which is power over not
which
just
is pretty wild
youth,
to think about,
but like over men.
Some 2,500 years ago, in a very patriarchal society,
Very.
like this woman is controlling the military, and telling people like who to go kill.
Right. That's
wild. So cool.
That is wild.
I mean, not the killing part, but like
right?
the command part.
So you can't sidestep that.
Yeah.
You can't. Phoebe in Romans 16. Delegating. So in the New Testament in particular, right, with these women characters, so you have Phoebe, Priscilla, Lydia, Junia is a big one too. The stuff that I've read on it is, if in fact you have the apostles, particularly the Apostle Paul, who is addressing these women in such a way and delegating to them the same authority or the same roles that the other ministers of the Gospels were doing, then they have apostolic authority.
Yeah, I mean, certainly to some degree, right?
The logic of that is bulletproof, right? Now, the question of dissent or the debate there is that actually what's happening? And like, people will go back and forth on that. Is that actually happening? But that's like a real monkey wrench.
Yeah.
Like, is Paul referring to these female characters as in the same way with the same roles that he is with these other apostles?
Like when he uses the same language for Phoebe in Romans 16 that he will use for himself and Cornelius, right, later on, it's the same word there. And so it's like, we really have to contend with that.
Correct.
There. It's hard to sidestep that.
Correct. And in the Old Testament, one of the big themes in Old Testament, the history, which is going to be, the historical books are pretty much from Joshua through Kings. So Joshua, 1st, 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. One of the big things that is there is the contrast between male and female characters by the narrator. It fascinated me the first time I saw this. Just to give you a few examples. The first one that I would see is how David and Bathsheba are contrasted in Samuel. David is the king, right? So in this context, when the king asks for a woman, she has no option.
Yeah, you can't
right?
refuse.
Like, we can't sugarcoat that, right? It was, he took her basically like he treated her like she was a call girl.
Yeah.
Okay. So in that context, the way that the characters are described is very interesting, because throughout the story of 2nd Samuel, David is going to deteriorate both in his power physically, and Bathsheba is actually going to gain more influence and power, to the point where in 1st Kings, she's actually orchestrating the events with the prophet Nathan and making sure that Solomon, her son, is going to get enthroned.
Right.
That's fascinating.
Right.
Also, in the cases where the kingdom is spiraling out of control, and Joab, who is the military leader for David, he's kind of like, dude, I'm losing control. I need to do something. It's really interesting that the characters that he goes to for wisdom are women. So specifically in 2 Samuel, chapter 20 and chapter 14, it mentions the woman of Tekoa. So there's this random wise woman that comes out of nowhere, and she solves the problem. I just think it's really fascinating, because Huldah is one of those also in 2 Kings, where she's a prophet, and the narrator is giving her credence that she's correctly perceiving what God is saying. So you have these female characters who are correctly understanding something in direct juxtaposition to the male characters who don't get something. That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's big, man.
So all that to say is, like, whatever your perspective may be, and however you may interpret these passages in Peter, where it talks about, again, the woman submitting to the man, Ephesians, Timothy, with very direct passages, right? They stand at least in tension with these very direct passages, right? So I want to be very frank and honest about that. I also want to talk about the next question.
Yeah, so the next question here is, do we tell women who have the desire to preach and teach that this isn't a desire placed in them from God? And this is probably functionally the most important question to me, because genuinely, and the reason that we have two men talking about this topic, if you're kind of curious about this, is because this is for us a conversation where we realize, like, these are some of the things that we have worked through and learned in our own experience. And because there are a bunch of men in leadership in the church, the hope is that we can establish some kind of commonality and understanding of saying, like, I don't know how to tell a woman that she has something that's placed in her that's not from God, especially when genuinely, probably out of the top 10 most gifted communicators I know, more than half of them are women. And for me in my personal life, almost every male influence I've ever had has cheated on his wife, and women have never, in my life, women have never done that. And so I know that's not always the case, right? And that's just an anecdotal example there, but that further intensifies the reality of this question for me, when it's like, I have seen male pastors fall time and time and time and time again, and we're going to tell women that this thing that they felt like they were born with, this burning desire to preach the gospel, they're not allowed to do that because they have the wrong genitalia. Like, that's a very weird and a very, like, just what the crap is going on, with that kind of thing. Yeah,
I once heard it this way from a commentator. Can we delegate roles based on gifts rather than genitals?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's good.
And that's a really poignant way to put it. So let me say this, right? On the one hand, our personal experiences of gifting and roles can't be the ultimate authority.
Yeah, of course.
At the same time, what seems to be kind of prevalent inclinations towards skills, right? Like, it said, well, hey, is it an accident that more women are nurses than men, or that more women are therapists than men, and more men are architects than women? Like, okay, like, you can make an argument for male and female being inclined towards certain things.
Yeah, as generalities,
but that doesn't make it the objective rule, right?
Sure.
So now, having said that, I do think it's an important question, because I think we have to think very critically about the merit of saying, hey, you have this communicator, a woman who wants to go to seminary, who wants to responsibly learn, teach, and disseminate for the purposes of furthering the gospel, leadership and teaching and preaching.
Right.
And so the only logical alternative is to say, well, you can't.
Or you can teach other women.
Right. So the way you sidesteps this is, you can teach youth, so you can teach kids, you can teach youth. The way I've seen it done at some places is up until they're 18. Yeah. And then you can't.
Which is all arbitrary.
Because then at 18 you're a man. So then you can't. And definitely not men, but you can teach other women, right? So that seems to be the logical way to kind of be consistent with it. But say, no, like, you can still teach and preach or give announcements.
Yeah.
Right?
Dude.
So I admit that seems arbitrary. And it seems flaky.
Well, all of those things are by nature, right? Because we would have to say, like, 18 for the male in American society is
not the same.
But it wasn't the same as a 12-year-old,
or it wasn't even the same 100 years ago.
No, not even close there.
Correct.
And we would say now that most men are probably still children until we're like 25.
Well,
there. And so,
yeah, you have a good point there.
So it's a weird thing to, like...
So the foundation keeps shifting.
Yeah.
And the rules keep changing.
The goalposts are always moving.
Correct.
There's nothing objective to build that on.
Correct.
Or there's nothing objective to walk out that exegetical conviction.
Correct.
Right. All of the hermeneutics are shifting sand.
Correct.
There, and that's hard for me.
Yes. So let me be 100% clear one more time, okay? Being a soft complementarian is really, really hard for me for all those reasons.
Yeah.
And the one that hits home the most for me is the reality of how much gets shielded under the guise of Christian authority or Christian leadership, right? Like, so many things, like pastoral abuse and manipulation and coercion, domestic violence, so many things get shielded under this, and it is absolutely shameful, right? And so not only is it hypocritical, right, and that the cost of credibility and consistency, but the social cost of that is incredibly hard to bear because it sounds so backwards.
Yeah.
And it sounds so like chauvinistic.
Yeah.
Right. And so I want to say how sensitive I am to all that. And that I can't think of a single time. I've been married for 4 years, okay? A single time I can't think of where I've said, no, like this is the choice we're going to make because I'm the man.
No, it's
because it doesn't make sense.
No, it sounds like you're signing your own death warrant, honestly.
So I've never, ever done that because that's not how marriage works. That's not how real relationships work, right? Now, granted that's different in a church context, right? Where you have more structured authority.
Yeah.
And you could say something like, hey, there's certain positions that women can and can't do. I want to concede all that, right? And say, yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah.
The only reason I'm still a soft complementarian is because in the passages like Ephesians 5 or 1 Timothy 2 or 1 Peter, I'm not there yet exegetically.
Sure, fair. That's fair.
That's it.
Yeah, that's
it really feels like I'm hanging on by a thread.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that honesty is like what it will take to kind of continue to move this conversation forward. So why don't you tell us about egalitarianism?
Okay, so the egalitarian position is very, very suspicious of something like separate but equal. And you know what? I got to say, yes.
Yeah.
If you hear separate but equal, you probably should be suspicious, right? Because it doesn't have a good track record.
It's weird to me when the nation gets it right before the church does.
So they're saying, wait, hold on. This is kind of like George Orwell's Animal Farm.
Yeah.
Everybody's equal, but some people are more equal than others, right? So like, I get it. And so the egalitarians are saying, no. On the one hand, with respect to creation, right? In creation, you're not only seeing an equality of value and nature, but you're seeing an equality of roles and an equality of participation in the creation duties and ministries. And so what sin is causing is actually a distorted hierarchy. And so to perpetuate or to continue that hierarchy under the guise of redemption of Christ is to mistake that.
Yeah.
And so any structure or any interpretation that would maintain a hierarchy, it's also called hierarchicalism or patriarchalism, is wrong. It's sinful, right? And so I've heard different interpretations because then the question becomes, all right, cool, but like, what are you going to do with Paul then? Because he seems to be pretty clear when he says things, again, man is the head of woman, just as Christ is the head of the church. Or in 1 Timothy 2, he's going to say some wild things like, I do not permit the woman to teach. She should be silent. So like, what do you do with those passages? So, I mean, I've heard a few things. On the one hand, I've heard Scott McKnight is a big guy. He's, pretty well-known theologian who's going to talk about this issue. And he'll appeal to cultural or contextual reasons, how we should understand the limitations of that command as a description of that time, but not a universal prescription of how it should be. So like there's reasons why women wouldn't be able to teach, the access they wouldn't have, or the resources they wouldn't have that would make it not doable for them, but that would make it doable for a woman to teach today. Another compelling thing that I've heard about egalitarianism in the face of those passages is, wait, hold on. So you want to pick and choose when you take Paul literally, but nobody's wearing headscarves. And so that's pretty interesting too, right? Because in 1 Corinthians, he's going to get
He's also appealing to nature with the headscarf.
Exactly.
Stuff,
He's because of the angels and because of nature. So wear a headscarf. Nobody does that.
No.
So
we do not.
If you pick and choose where you're going to take interpretation culturally or no, this is universal, then I see the suspicion as well. And so the overall argument for egalitarianism is that no, it's not only equality in nature and essence, but it's also equality in roles. And so here's a question I want to ask you about egalitarianism, and the one that seems most important to me. What role do you think social progressivism or social values and trends play in swaying the Christian interpretation towards egalitarianism?
And I think this is probably the key driving question, right? Because for me, the arrival at egalitarianism was not one that came out of social progressivism, but one that came out of exegetical convictions there. It's just...
That's fair.
But what I think and what that means basically is like I didn't feel pressure from culture to be like super pro women. That's not like whatever. It wasn't my thing there, right? For me, it came out of how I read Genesis 1 and Ephesians 5 in particular, and probably Romans 16 is the most important passage to me in Scripture on this specific topic. But I think the role that social progressivism is one that kind of casts a looming shadow, right? Because especially in the church, there is this real either embracing of or repellent from the idea of wokeism, right? And this idea of like
and the
we
tension
have to, and we have to embrace every social change that's happening in society. It's like, look, the whole point of being a follower of Christ is that people are going to look at you weird. They called us cannibals in the first 3 centuries, right? Because they said that we ate babies.
The Eucharist.
Yeah. And so it's like we've always been kind of weird with that. And so if you're not being kind of strange or seen as a little bit sus by society, then like you're probably a little bit missing out on some of that stuff.
All right.
But I think it plays a tremendous revelation in recognizing and understanding that when we live in the world that we live in, right? Romans 12 being in the world but not of the world, we are constantly managing our expectations and our understandings and our biases through the world in which we live in. And this is the tension that postmodernism has taught us, I think correctly, is that like we can't always identify our biases. There's no way to completely remove ourselves out of our cultural context and point to like some capital T universal truth that applies to any and every person and be like, found it. There it is, right? Like I'm always going to see things through the perspective of a white dude. And it's like, that's just my bag and that's who I am and that's what it's always going to be. And so there's going to be some good things that come with that and some not
limitations.
Just like imperialist kind of things that can roll with that sometimes that are not good, right? And so
for the throat there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is just kind of is what it is. And so recognizing that though, it's not a good thing, by the way. Let me be very clear for the audience. But recognizing that, right, is the thing that puts us in the ability to say, truth is progressive on some nature, right? And we see this in the theology of accommodation that exists all throughout the meta-narrative of Scripture, right? And so it's like God never intended for there to be divorce there, but that was something that Moses allowed because the hearts of men were hardened and those kinds of things. And so it's like the idea here is God is working through whatever system that works for human beings at the time because that's how God chose to reveal God's self to us there. Yeah. And so as we grow in faithfulness and as we continue to, nurture that idea there, God is able to reveal more. And so as we just like we understand now that, men don't carry the entire totality of life in semen and women are just like the oven that bakes the baby there, but it takes both, They're like, we have better understandings of the role that women can play in leadership. Like, women are trustworthy. We don't need 2 of them to equal one man's say in court. It's like, and so those things change as we get better. There, as a church, as society, as human beings. And so this might be an example of one of those things.
Okay, good. Yeah. So I gotta say, for me, like I said, the social cost of it is the heaviest for me to bear, right? Because I want to say, yes, believe women when they are raising up their voice against abuse. Yes, I want to say that. I want to empower people, women in particular, to feel like they do not need to be hidden or repressed of abuse.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so it's very hard for me to say that and say, yes, support women and Me Too and all these kinds of things, and at the same time say, and I'm a soft complementarian. Like that's a really, really hard place for me to be at.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think part of what you're suggesting is that being able to recognize that tension, I think that sets me up to be able to grow. I hope.
Yeah, I mean, naturally.
Yeah. And that I can hopefully continue to work through that tension and continue to, see some of these.
You just got to keep exegeting. It'll come out. It'll come.
Awesome. So, guys, what do you think? Leave us a comment. What are some of the biggest costs that you see with each of these views? And how have you experienced maybe these views being played out at your church? We'd love to hear from you guys. We'll see you next time.